Hey everyone, there are three important ways to do reusability in React. And I came across this some time ago. I don't know who the original author is, so I can't take credit for this, but I will try my best to explain it. Right, so if you want to reuse JSX or markup logic, create a separate component. If you want to reuse simple JavaScript logic, create a utility function. If you want to reuse logic with React hooks in there, create a custom hook. I don't know who the original thinker was, but I think that's a very clever way of thinking about things. And throughout the video, I will use this trackback project as the example. So this is one of the projects actually from my React and Next.js course. A lot of people enjoyed it a lot. Let me zoom in a little bit so you can see what's going on here. So people can just list the things they want to take for vacation, let's say, so that they don't forget it. I can also add an item like this and I can delete them. All right, so in a project like that, we may have some kind of item list component, and we may actually also decide to add some kind of a theme toggle at some point so that the user can switch between light mode and dark mode, right? We've seen these everywhere. It's very standard. Now, what you may want to do at some point is you may want to allow the user to reset to a default. So we may have a button here, let's say, that is something like this, right? So just a button reset to default with some background color, with some styling here. And in this component, we may also want to have a button that allows the user to just reset to the initial or default value, right? So now I also have a reset button right here. And in an application, you want to be consistent with your styles. So this button actually has the same styles as this button here because they are both reset buttons. It makes sense that we use the same styles for reset buttons throughout our application. And as a result of this, we actually have some duplication now, right? This is actually very common. You're going to have duplication in your JSX. So whenever you have duplication in your JSX or markup, you may want to consider extracting it out to a separate component. So you can easily reuse this button whenever you need some kind of reset functionality, right? So components are meant for reusing JSX or markup essentially. So let's actually do that. Let's quickly create a reset button component. So I'm going to take this button and I'm actually just going to paste it right here. Now I put this JSX, this markup in its own component, and now I can use this component to reuse the JSX or markup whenever I want a reset button, right? So instead of duplicating myself here, I can just swap this out with a reset button component, right? And then also here, I don't want to have duplication in my JSX. I'm going to extract it out into one component. And now whenever I want to reuse that JSX, I just use that component, right? And of course, we can make this with the children prop, right? We can make it fancier than this. But the point here is if you want to reuse JSX or markup, you can just simply create a component. So that's one way of reusing something in React. All right, so then for the second one, let's go here. Typically in a list like this, you don't hard code these LIs. Typically, you are keeping track of these items in some array, perhaps in state, right? So here we could have use state, let's say, right? So then here you have all your items and you would just map over them here, right? So this would be very typical, right? So you just map over each item and then you would create an LI for each one of them, right? So let's say an item is just a string and maybe we want to uppercase the first character of the string. So you cannot just do that with CSS because with CSS, you're going to uppercase every word. We only want the first word. So it turns out this is actually a little bit tricky to do. You need some JavaScript magic here. So you need to take the first character and then we can uppercase that. But that's only the first character. Now we need to combine that with the other one. And this is how you could do that. I'm ignoring the Typescript here. It's not important, but you can see the syntax is not great here. And we may actually want to do something similar here in theme toggle. So we may want to say something like current theme, and maybe we are also keeping track of that in state, right? Use state here, current theme, and then we just want to output a theme. But you can see it's lowercase here. Maybe I also want to uppercase, but only the character of the first word. So if it happens to have multiple words, I don't want to do that, right? So let's see if Copilot is a genius today. No, maybe now. Yeah, so now you can see we have the same logic here, right? So now we also have duplicate logic again. We have now a way of essentially uppercasing the first character of a string. So in React, if you have some logic that you want to reuse throughout your application, you may want to put it in a utility function or helper function and not a custom hook, right? So custom hook, we'll get to that in a second. That's for when you are reusing logic with React hooks in there, right? But here we are not using React hooks. Right, so for this type of logic, we don't want to create a custom hook. We just want to create a utility or helper function. So typically in your folder structure, you would have some kind of library folder. And then in there, we can create a utils file or helpers file. And then here we can put all of the logic that we want to reuse throughout our application. And the logic here would not use React hooks, right? So this is just plain JavaScript logic, you could say. So let's actually extract this out into a separate utility function. So we could call that capitalize, let's let's say, and we need to be able to call this with our string, right? So I would like to replace all of this with just something like capitalize and then passing in the theme. Right, so this is how I would like to use it. So then here I need to accept some string that is actually of type string. And just to make it clear, we could also just call it str. And then we want to return that string, whatever the user is passing in, capitalized, but only the first word, right? So we would do something like this. So now we have encapsulated that logic here within one function. Now we can use this function to reuse that logic, right? So we're centralizing the shared logic in this function here. Now I can use it like this. I do need to import it, but you can see this is how I would then use it. So then here I could come here, I can replace all of this nasty code here with just one clean function and just pass item like that, right? So now you can see I can reuse this logic throughout my application very easily. If I ever need to make a change, I know where to look, right? That's one of the benefits of extracting it out into a separate function like this, is if you do want to make a change, you only have to change it in one place and it will automatically be applied in all the instances where you're using it. So in React, if you just have some plain JavaScript logic that you want to reuse, just create a utility function. Don't create a custom hook, because here we are not using any React hooks like useState or useEffect. All right, so then number 3 here, let's say we want to store the items in local storage. That's actually what we're doing in the project as well. And in the course, we are actually using toStand. And toStand makes it super easy to persist in local storage. But even without toStand, it shouldn't be too difficult, right? So the reason we want to put it in local storage is so that if the user leaves our app here, right? So if I refresh here, we still want to keep the items. We want to persist it, right? So if I refresh, you can see they are still here no matter how many times I refresh. If I close that tab and I go back here again, you can see I still have my items right here. How do we implement that? So let's say we have our items here. Let's say we are keeping track of them here in useState. How do we make sure that when items change, so let's say when I add something to the list, that I'm actually persisting that in local storage? So we actually need to do 2 things. We need to add something to local storage, and then when I come back, we need to get it out of local storage again. And actually, just to show you how that looks like here, so you can go to application, and then here there is local storage, right? So you can click here and you'll see whatever is in local storage, right? So you can see here local storage has one key, it has items, and the value for that is just an array with all of those items, right? Good mood, passport, and phone charger, right? So whenever the user adds an item or deletes an item, basically whenever this array gets updated, we want to persist that in local storage. So what you can do is you can use useEffect, right? So here you can say whenever there is a change in the items array, we want to persist that in local storage, right? So that's the first part, data local storage, right? So we can just do local storage dot set item. We need to specify under what key, right? So here we want to store it under items, right? So the key here is what we see here. We're going to store the value under this key, right? And this is just a simplified example of the actual project, right? So we're not actually running this code. This is just the example. So then the actual value for items, right? So here, then you need to specify the actual value for that key, and that should just be the items array. Now in local storage, we need to store it as a string. So we can actually just make it a JSON string. We can say JSON.stringify, because items is actually an array. So we're going to stringify that, and then we'll put it in local storage under the items key. So now whenever this items variable changes, we are persisting that in local storage. So now the idea is that when I refresh or when the user comes back, that we can pull it out of local storage again. So the second part is getting data from local storage. So how do we do that? Well, you can actually just directly access local storage in here. So what we could do is we could do something like initial items, local storage dot get item. Well, which one do you want? Well, we call that items here. So that's the one that we want. And so then here, when you load the app, this will run for the first time and it will get the items from local storage. And that's what we can initialize state with here. The downside of doing it this way is that now whenever this component re-renders, and it may render for whatever reason, you're going to access local storage and then get item. And this is not great for performance. Ideally, we only run this once when the component first mounts, right? When the app first loads, essentially. We don't need to run this whenever the component re-renders. So we actually have another option here with useState. A lot of people actually don't know about it. You can also, instead of specifying, you know, an empty array or a variable for the initial value, you can actually also specify a function here. And this function will only run once when the state is first initialized, right? So here you can make sure that it will only run once. So whatever you return from this, that will be the initial state, right? So we can actually just do the same in here, and then this will only run once, right? So this is how we are getting data from local storage. storage. Now the data that we are getting is actually in JSON format, because here you can see we are stringifying it. So whatever we get here, we do need to parse that back to a normal JavaScript format. So we're just going to say json.parse. Now TypeScript will warn us here because we are trying to get items from the local storage. It's technically possible that there is nothing there. The user could have cleaned their browser data, or there could be something else. There could be simply no data there. So here what you would get back is null. You cannot pass null to json.parse. So that's why we get this issue here. We're going to ignore TypeScript here for a second, just so I can get the point across. So now we have a way of setting data as well as getting data from local storage. Now that's for the items, but we may actually want to do the exact same for the theme as well. You can imagine that if the user sets the theme to dark mode, if they set it to dark mode, we don't have the theme toggle here, but imagine that there is a toggle here for dark mode. When the user comes back, we still want to make the app dark mode, right? So we also want to persist the theme, and we actually want to reuse that logic here, right? So what you could do is you could copy and paste that, right? So here you could copy and paste all of that, and then of course we wouldn't have items. I would have a theme here, set the theme, right? So I would replace everything here with theme, and let me import use effect here. So now I'm doing the same for the theme as well. And now you may say, aha, we have some duplication here. We want to reuse this logic for local storage. You may want to create a utility function just like we did for capitalize. Well, that's not what we want to do, because here we are actually using React hooks. We're using use state and use effect. So here we actually want to create a custom hook, because when you're using hooks, these hooks, they come with some constraints. You cannot use them after a conditional. They have to be at the top level of the component, right? So those are the rules of hooks, and a normal utility function can be used anywhere and anytime. So a normal utility function does not have that constraint. So instead of creating a utility function for this, here we actually want to create a custom hook. So what you could do is, very typically, you could just have a hooks file. So hooks.ts, we could call that use local storage. It's actually a very common hook, so I think it's good to learn how this is implemented as well. And now we can try removing it from here and actually putting the logic in here. Notice that a custom hook always starts with the word use. This is to indicate that this is not just a normal utility function. This is using React hooks under the hood, as we'll see. Right, so now let's see if we can actually extract this into a reusable hook. The benefits of that will be that we can easily reuse that logic, but also it will simply clean up the component as well, as we can remove all of this logic out of the component. We can put it somewhere else, and so the component will look much cleaner as well. So typically what I do is I take one of the instances of that logic, I just copy everything, and I put that here in my custom hook. I will import use state, right? So I'm using React hooks here under the hood. So now I copied that theme example in here, but the goal of this hook is that it's reusable. So we took this one instance and we put it here, but now we also want to use it for other instances. So we need to make it more general, right? So that's how I always approach this. So here, instead of theme, well, it could be any value, not just a theme. It can also be items. It can be something else as well. So here you want to change the names to something more general, right? So here we can have some value, right? So we can just make it a more general name, a set of value. Right here we are still using theme. Well, that should just be value. Same for this one here, set item. Okay, now here we have the string theme still. Well, this is that key in local storage. So we cannot just do value, because then it would always have literally value here, right? So for the key in the local storage, that needs to be determined when you actually use the hook. So if I replace all of that, you can see how much cleaner it looks. I can just import this hook here, and then, well, we need a way to specify the actual key. So that actually does need to be something that we specify when we call the hook, right? So here you can imagine that I would like to call this with theme in this case. And then for our item list, we can also replace all of this. You can see how big of a difference that is. And here the key, I think we called that just simply items, right? Let me import this as well. Now we get a problem here because right now our hook is not accepting an input, right? So here we do need to specify an input, right? Do not do something like this, like destructuring the props of a component. This is just a JavaScript function, so we just have a parameter name like this, and key needs to be a string, right? So we can type that as a string, right? So then when we set data in local storage here in the hook, it cannot be literally, it should not be theme. It should be whatever the key is that the user of this hook has specified, right? So we need to replace this with key, and we also, when we get it then from local storage, we need to specify the key, right? So then here it should be whatever the key is. And then here we also need to add it to the dependency array. Okay, so now we have our reusable hook. You can see how much it cleans up the component here, and we can now very easily reuse this whenever we need that local storage persistence, including in other projects, right? So over time you actually build up a nice library of these reusable hooks. Now let me actually remove this because I don't want to see any red squiggly lines here. Let me actually remove the previous examples here as well. Let me just remove this entire thing here as well as these imports, right? So now we are not using useEffect and useState anymore in this component, not directly at least, right? We are still technically using useEffect and useState in this component, but it's just written somewhere else, right? So this is the exact same as just literally writing it here, right? So it doesn't really change the behavior of anything. We can literally write useState and useEffect, all that logic still here in the component, but we have just put it somewhere else, but it works the exact same. So a custom hook is also bound to those rules of hooks, right? So you cannot call it after condition or in some loop or in any block. It always needs to be at the top level of the component. And that makes sense when you think about it, because when you use this, it's the exact same as using useState and useEffect directly in there. And you cannot use these in some if statement or after a condition either, right? So the rules stay the same. Now here, of course, we should get the value back from the hook as well, because if we still want to use that theme like before, let's say current theme, well, I may actually still want to use it like before, right? So where am I getting the theme from now? Well, this hook should return that, right? So this hook should still return whatever value is in here, right? So I can return it as a so-called tuple here in TypeScript. It's called a tuple when you have an array with a set number of values, right? It's just an array essentially. And then to use that, it's actually very similar as the useState hook. You can do destructuring here with an array, and you can actually immediately call that whatever you want. So we are actually renaming this as we are destructuring. We can do that with an array, right? So here the array is returning something called value and set value. However, we can actually already call it theme and set theme when we get it from here. So then we can just use theme. Same with items here. We may actually still want to loop over the items, right? Items.map. Where are we getting those items from? Well, we're getting it from this hook. So how do we get it from that hook? Well, it's the same, right? And this hook is returning value and set value, but we can immediately give it the name that we want here. So we can say items and then set items, right? So here I'm returning the values as an array here. The benefit of returning it as an array is that you can immediately use the name that you would like to use. So you are essentially renaming it as you are destructuring it, right? So this is actually the same as with useState. The downside of this is that you do need to get the order right? So here, if I misremember the order and I'm gonna call it set theme here and then theme for whatever reason, set theme will not be that function actually. Right, so it will not be that setter function. Set theme will actually be the value, right? So this can cause some gnarly bugs. So that is the main downside with returning it as an array. You can also return it as an object, of course. So here I can return it as an object, and then here, when you use it, you need to destructure it as an object. Now with an object, you can use any order you want. But when you are destructuring an object and you want to rename the value, you do first need to actually use the same name. So here I would actually first have to actually explicitly say I want to use the value here, and then I can rename it as a theme here. And here I have to destructure set value explicitly, and then I can rename it to set theme. Right? The benefit of doing it as an object is that the order does not matter, right? So if you get the order wrong, that's not a problem. The downside is that the renaming isn't as nice. Now here, use local storage is actually very similar to the useState hook that you get in React. So here I think the odds of getting the order wrong are small because it works the same as with useState. So here I would actually use an array. So let me actually return it as an array. All right, so this is now a nice reusable hook. Whenever we need to persist data and local storage, we can just take that hook, you can just use it in any component. So that's good for reusability, but as you can see, it also cleans up the component. We have removed a lot of the logic, and also we know what the logic is doing now, right? The name of the custom hook tells me what kind of logic is being implemented here, right? Before, if I just had all of this stuff directly here in the component, yeah, of course I wrote down some comments here, but let's say you don't have those comments, you just have this. Well, I don't really know what's going on here. I really have to sit down and parse this stuff here to understand what's going on here. But not only does it look messy, it actually takes some time and energy to understand what kind of logic is being implemented here. So with a custom hook, you are essentially also just applying a label to the logic that is being implemented, so it's very easy to understand what's going on in a particular component, right? So if you want to reuse JSX or markup logic, create a separate component. If you want to reuse simple JavaScript logic, create a utility function. If you want to reuse logic with React hooks in there, create a custom hook. I don't know who the original thinker was, but I think that's a very clever way of thinking about things. Now, one thing here is we did cheat a little bit here with Typescript. So here, when we get data from local storage, we don't know if there's actually going to be something there. So it's possible that the get item actually returns null, and we can actually not pass null to JSON.parse. So parse does not accept null. So in case get item actually returns null, we may actually also want to specify some initial or default value. But what should it be actually? So if we want to start off this state with some initial value, if there is nothing in local storage, well, what should it be? Should it be an array? Well, not really, because if we are using this for the theme, let's say, theme is not an array, it's just a plain string, right? So here, I don't want to have a default value of just an array. In fact, it should be up to the user of this hook to determine what the value should be if there is nothing in local storage, right? So here we can expose another parameter here. We can say initial value, and that's simply what it should be if there is nothing in local storage. Now, this is actually being parsed as JSON, so we should probably make it a JSON string so it doesn't interfere with that. Now, the initial value here is getting parsed as JSON, right? So it is assuming that this is, we may want to turn this into a JSON string. So we can say JSON.stringify, so it will be correctly parsed, right? So now we have this. Okay, so now the user needs to pass in the initial value in case there is nothing in local storage yet. So here the initial value for theme would probably be light, right? Let's say the default is light mode. And then here, let's say if there is nothing in local storage, we probably just want to start off with an empty array, right? So you can see I'm using an array type here and here a string. So then here for that parameter, how should we type that actually, right? So here I cannot use a string here. If I do this, you can see that here it works, right? Because this is a string, but here we actually have an array, right? So this is actually a little bit tricky. So you could say, okay, we'll make it some array type, right? So you can say, oh, I'll make it some array type or something like that. But you can imagine that we may actually also want to use an object, right? So we could use all sorts of types here. So instead of going down this route, you may think, oh, I'm just going to type it as any. It could be anything. Well, typically you don't want to use any, but the major downside of using any is if you do it this way, now if you hover theme, it will not be correctly typed as any. We will not be able to get the correct type, which should be string here, right? And here for items, it should be some kind of array. Because we are typing it like this, we will not be able to get it right. So in this situation, where you could be specifying multiple different types, we may actually want to use a so-called type parameter or generic, right? We're going to turn this into a generic function. And this is a little bit advanced, so it's okay if you don't fully follow along here. I just quickly want to show you how these TypeScript generics work in custom hooks, because very often with custom hooks, you will actually use generics. You may want to type it as some T, right? So here we can specify T here. Now, if you have a type parameter, you always have to specify that up front here. So here, just to specify to TypeScript, hey, I'm going to use a type parameter here. I'm going to call it T, and that's what I'm using here. Okay, so now I just told you that now when we hover theme, we should be able to get the correct type here for the value that we get back out of there. But as you can see, we are still getting this any type. So here what we also want to do to get that correct type for the user of the hook is we also want to specify what the return value will be. Right, so here we are returning something and we can specify the type of that here. So you do it with colon after the list of parameters. You specify the types for the value as well as the set value here. If I save here, it gets formatted a little bit differently. We can use the T again. So here we want to encode a relationship because whatever the type is of what we pass in. So for example, here I'm passing in the string light. That's also the type that you get back out of it here, right, as the first value. So that lets TypeScript know that if I pass in a string here, the first value that you get back out of there is also a string, right? So now you can see we are getting the correct type here. Same with item list. If I pass in an array here, we just specified that whatever type you pass in, that's the exact same type that you also get as the first value here. First value here is the same type as the initial value here. So if I pass in an array here, now if I hover this, you can see we are also getting some kind of array here. It's of type never because we haven't specified yet what type of array this is, but you can see at least it's some array, right? So this is the power of TypeScript generics. I have other videos about TypeScript, including generics, but one of the major use cases for it is to specify a relationship, right? So here there is a relationship between what you pass in as the initial value as well as what you get back out of it. And the same with the other value here, we are actually passing the setter function here that we get from useState here. So that's actually just a function that takes in something, but that also has to be of that type, right? So here, basically this function here, setTheme, if we call setTheme somewhere, well, we cannot call this with an array or something like that. Right, so this also needs to be the same type as what we pass here as the initial value, right? So this can only be a string, and we can encode that relationship with this type parameter, right? So you can see we have all these t's here. There's a relationship there, which is that they are all the same type. So here, if I hover setTheme, you can see setTheme in this case is going to be a function that takes in a string, right? Takes in a string, not any. And here, if I hover setItems here, you can see it takes in something of type array, right? So a little bit advanced here. You don't have to understand that, but I think it's good to know because with custom hooks, you're often going to see these TypeScript generics. So if you set it up like this, here we still have that array of never. What you can then even do is you can specify the type yourself, just like you could do with useState. You can even do something like this. That's going to be an array of strings. You can specify it directly like that. So then here, that will be the T. So then what you get back out of that, that will be the same type. So then what you get back out of it, items here, is indeed an array of strings. But I have to say, this is already pretty advanced, so it's okay if you don't follow along here. We do talk a lot about TypeScript in my React and Next.js course as well. We start from absolute scratch in that course and we build everything up step by step. So I highly recommend you go through my professional React and Next.js course if you want to master the latest React as well as the latest Next.js, including the relevant TypeScript. In that course, we actually built some other custom hooks as well. So for example, in the remote dev project, we are actually also creating custom hooks for data fetching, right? So here I'm using useJobItem because we're fetching some job item data. And here we are also using the useDebound hook. So this is actually also a very common hook. And we actually implement this also from scratch, step by step. And it actually also happens to use a type parameter. So the value here is the same as what you get back out of it. And here actually we also use the use local storage hook. And we also have a hook here for use on click outside. So if you click outside a modal or pop over, let's say, this is, you may want to close the modal or pop over. And you can see actually this hook does not use useState. It only has this use effect in there, right? So you don't always need useState in a custom hook. You can actually use any React hook. Sometimes it's only the use effect. And actually another good use case for custom hooks is when you are using the context API. So to consume the context, you may actually want to create a custom hook for that. I have a separate video on that, but that's another good use case for creating a custom hook. As you can see, we have quite a few of them. And of course, there are also websites that actually show you some custom hooks out of the box. So you don't have to create those common custom hooks from scratch. You can see there is actually already somebody that has created that for you. Check out my React and Next.js course if you want to master the latest React and Next.js. It's my best work. I highly recommend you check it out. Thanks for watching this video. Hope it was helpful and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.